Well, we do know that at least three African leaders will be making their way to the G20 Summit. For more insights and analysis on Africa's perspective on the summit, we're joined here in our Nairobi studios by Israel Kodiaga. He's a specialist consultant on Africa's political, social, economic and security landscape at Southern Delta International. Well, thank you so much for joining us in studio, Israel. What should Africa, and I suppose the developing world in general, expect from this G20 Summit?
Thank you very much. Maybe before I even say something of what Africa should expect from the G20 Summit, we need to understand a little about the background. The G20 summits go back to 1999, when the first summit was held in the United States of America. And thereafter, there have been, of course, a series of summits every year. And of course, the G20 would like to be recognized or to be seen as a premier organization whose primary objectives are in the twin areas of cooperation and development. That being the case as it is, therefore, ordinarily, we should expect that the G20 would promote those twin issues of cooperation and development. Now, coming back to Africa, what should Africa expect from the G20 summit? My take is nothing. And why Africa should expect nothing from the G20 summit is because, one, the matter of the G20 is a little problematic because of one, in its relationship with Africa. One, Africa is grossly underrepresented in the G20. For a fact, it is only South Africa who is officially a member of the G20. So when South Africa is a member of the G20, South Africa cannot therefore be seen to be representing African interests. Two, when it comes to the issues of the G20 agenda, Africa is never involved in the setting up of the agenda. So it's actually about their issues, their agendas, and therefore Africa, when we go to the G20, either as invited guests, like in the case of Nigeria, Egypt, and of course we know African Union, NEPAD, and others, they are going as guests on a forum whose agenda is already set.
But on that note then, I mean, as you mentioned, it's South Africa, it's Nigeria, it's Egypt, it's NEPAD. There is an opportunity for engagement. What should African leaders then prioritize in their engagement in the G20 summit?
Thank you very much. One, there is no short supply of opportunities for engagement. Already, most of the members of the G20 are already engaged with African nations in very many ways. China, for example, is already having the FOCAC program, and so are the BRICS and the other groups. So what the African leaders should prioritize when it comes to the engagement with the G20 are in the 5 critical areas. Number one, the African leaders should insist on the increase or inclusion of more African countries into the G20 summit, either regionally, when we are talking about the ECOWAS, the East African Community, and maybe the SADC, that should be one aspect, inclusion. Number two, the African leaders should insist that before we go for the G20 summits, wherever they are held, there should be the involvement of the African government's technical teams, the technical personnel involved in critical issues which are urgent and of pertinent needs to those specific countries, so that when the G20 are sitting and they're looking at the agenda already has issues which resonate and are directly linked to the needs of the Africans. The third area is broadening the B20 outreach programs. You see, the G20 have got the B20 outreach programs, and most of the companies of the B20 which are operating in Africa lack the financial muscle and resources to actually reach broader areas within the African landscape. The fourth area that the African leaders need to insist on when we are talking about, when they are negotiating or talking with the members of the G20 is the need to actually have linkages and a direct influence and catch the eyes of the finance ministers of the G20 countries. Because more often than not, whatever is discussed at the G20 summits, when the G20 members go back to their countries, the ministers work on their budgets on critical matters that are only relevant to them. So what happens? The G20 is at best an academic exercise or some intellectual exercise similar to the Vienna Congresses of the many years before. So in essence, when we are talking about the G20 and Africa, there is need now for direct interaction and of course attuning those issues that the G20 is focusing on to direct issues that are of urgent need to the African countries. The fifth area would be also the aspect of ensuring that there is no disconnect, that you see there is some kind of an environment where the members of the G20, whatever they discuss with the African countries at the G20, does not conflict with what they do with the African countries individually in their own individual ways. Otherwise, there will be a lot of duplication and a lot of disconnect. Thank you.
We'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much, Israel. That, of course, being Israel Kodiaga from Southern Delta International on the truth around what Africa can expect, of course, from the G20 Summit.